Good morning. It's wonderful to follow that dazzling presentation by John. Of course, I taught him everything he knows. On August 7th, 1942, there was an important gathering in Tokyo at Imperial General Headquarters. Senior officers assembled to listen to a briefing by an intelligence officer, Colonel Sakita Ichiji. And Ichiji had had a very successful war to date. He had been a participant in the British surrender at Singapore, and he's actually present in a famous photograph about that surrender. After reviewing the situation of the war to date, he turned to that task that intelligence officers always face, projecting what the adversary is going to do. And Sakita said he thought it was very unlikely that the Americans would be striking anywhere along Japan's broad new Pacific frontier, that the most likely American movement at this point would be to attempt to establish bomber bases in the Soviet maritime provinces northwest of the Japanese home islands and conduct a strategic bombing campaign. That's the exact same day, August 7th, 1942, the Marines splashed ashore on the then very obscure island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal is on a bearing of about 180 degrees at a distance of more than 4,700 nautical miles from the Soviet maritime provinces. This briefing proved to be a turning point in Colonel Sakita's career. When next we encounter him, he's an intelligence officer with the Japanese command on Guadalcanal itself, and there he will remain, and in fact, he will survive. John's laid out where we are as we get to August of 1942 very ably, and it is simply a rolling nightmare for the anti-Axis forces up to that point, with extremely limited moments of possible hope. And then there is a bright moment that comes in May and June 1942, when the U.S. Navy is able to achieve successes at Coral Sea and Midway and change at least the momentum in the Pacific, stop the Japanese advance, initially across the South Pacific and then in the Central Pacific. What I've done with this presentation, I've added these little white arrows to remind you that this campaign fought over 6 months of intense fighting on land, sea, and air, because both sides were pretty much in balance, follows this incredibly tumultuous up and down seesaw struggle throughout almost this entire period. In mid-October 1943, in Washington, it's really believed that we're going to lose at Guadalcanal, and these will sort of be little markers to follow this sort of seesaw as we go along. So how do we get here? The Japanese do not revert entirely to defensive. After the Battle of Midway, the Imperial Army wants to finally settle accounts with the Chinese, and the Imperial Army is planning to do a showdown campaign in China to knock China out of the war at the end of the year. The Imperial Navy has its eyes on a link-up across the Indian Ocean with the Germans, which did have very fraught prospects for the Allies at that point. And they're not exactly still in the South Pacific. The Imperial Navy is building an air base on the island of Guadalcanal, which, as Don pointed out, this really threatens the lines of communication, sea lines of communication to Australia. I've described it as stepping on the sciatic nerve of the Allied strategy because it was exactly as John depicted it. It's unitary. Everywhere that shipping was going was critical to anything the U.S. or the British could do in the war and our ability to sustain our allies. The Imperial Army is conducting this overland march on the southern tip of the huge island of New Guinea, marching down the Kokoda Trail towards Port Moresby, again threatening Australia. So that's where we are as we get into July 1942. Now, in thinking about this, and I've done this for a very long time, one of the most important things about this campaign, which is beyond all the interesting and intricate military, naval, and air aspects, really what it came down to in terms of the views of the American people, you get back to Clausewitz and on war and one of his aspects. At the exact same day that the Marines splashed ashore on Guadalcanal, in the New York Times that day, there was coverage of a Gallup poll, and that showed that 64% of the Americans who responded said that they did not believe that Franklin Roosevelt or Winston Churchill should be making military decisions in the war. And what Clausewitz laid out was this trinity he described of a nation at war: the people, the government, and the armed forces. And in the largest possible viewpoint of what Guadalcanal stood for Americans, was this was a moment when the American people were looking at the government and the armed forces and wanting to see demonstrations of competence that they might be able to carry forward and win the war. That was where we were in terms of doubts about what the outcome of the war was at that time. By the way, Clausewitz is wearing his Prussian ballroom camouflage uniform there, as you can see. And here we are in the Pacific. Put a little star there to represent Guadalcanal. It's about 25 or 50 times bigger than the island itself, but it shows you where it is. And you can just, at a glance, you can see logistically, both for the U.S. and for Japan, supporting operations on the Solomons was an enormous, enormous challenge. And here's the local area in which the campaign is going to be fought. You'll see on the lower right-hand side the island of Guadalcanal. On Guadalcanal, I've marked the airfield called Henderson Field, which is going to become the pivot point for holding or losing Guadalcanal during this campaign. The main Japanese base is in the upper left-hand corner there, Rabaul. And it is without peer in the area. Not only is it big, has a big harbor, it actually has airfields with concrete runways, which are absolutely unheard of in this whole theater at that time. We get to Guadalcanal primarily because of Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations, who basically wills it into being. He does so because he wants to follow up the victory at Midway. He believes there's going to be enough resources for the U.S. to conduct offensive operations in both Europe and the Pacific. Critically, he wins the support of General George C. Marshall because, as John pointed out, Marshall thought the important move for the U.S. in 1942 was to open a campaign on the European continent, in important part to relieve the Soviet Union. When the British proved to be unwilling to go along with that, Marshall at least saw the idea that Guadalcanal would tie down the Japanese and prevent them from joining the Germans in an assault on the Soviet Union. So immediately, in the concept of the operation, the notion that this is, in fact, part of a global world struggle is there right at the beginning. And they issue an order on 2 July 42 for what's overall called Operation Pestilence. And the first phase describes the objective as seizing, quote, Tulagi and adjacent positions, unquote. The island of Guadalcanal is not even mentioned. The 1st Marine Division, which is going to be the principal land element for this operation, the staff of that, for the first time, shows that they are really first-rate. They recognize that the airfield on Guadalcanal is really the key terrain to seize around Guadalcanal. And you see the following on prospect after this is after that phase is done. The follow-on campaigns up to Solomons, up New Guinea, and eventually at phase 3, taking Rabaul as being the ultimate objective. And those campaigns are going to consume basically the middle part of the entire Pacific War up to February 1944. So the official Marine Corps history sums it up very aptly that at the prospect of looking at what they were going to do, the operation did not look like an optimistic proposition. And if we look at the operational checklist, we'll see that there were good reasons for doubts about exactly how likely success was. I've used a little bit of wit here, but in point of fact, every one of those elements is as bad as I'm depicting them, or whatever here. Had Guadalcanal been lost, I am quite certain the conventional wisdom later would have been, obviously, any operation embarked upon under these circumstances could not possibly have succeeded. You know, what were they thinking? Well, nonetheless, for the first 72 or 90-some hours of the operation, counting the transit immediately approaching Guadalcanal, everything goes our way. Every single break goes our way. We achieved strategic, operational, and tactical surprise. The Marines land on Guadalcanal. By the second day, they hold the land that Henderson Field is going to be created on. And everything seems to be going swimmingly. And then this is Guadalcanal, so of course, after something like this, with an up arrow, what happens? Of course, disaster follows immediately. A very astute Japanese admiral, Mikawa Gunichi, assembles a scratch task force, sails down to Guadalcanal, and that night of August 8th, 9th, administers the most humiliating defeat the U.S. Navy has known at sea in its history, the Battle of Savo Island, sinks 4 cruisers, 3 American, 1 Australia. It forces the amphibious force to depart on August 9th. They're taking away a great part of the supplies, equipment, some of the Marines, and leaving the Marines stranded on Guadalcanal and over on Tulagi and adjacent positions. And so begins one of the great epic stories of the United States Marine Corps, the struggle for Guadalcanal. Well, one thing about the surprise is that it's a gift that keeps on giving, because the Japanese initially, like Colonel Sugita, cannot comprehend at first that this was really a major effort. They tend to, is this a raid? Is this some sort of subordinate operation? And they don't think a major operation will be mounted by the U.S. until 1943. So at first, in the first critical phase, probably for about 2 months, the Japanese completely underestimate what's going on at Guadalcanal and what the stakes are. So the first thing they do is they send a small reinforced battalion, small regimental group under this Colonel Icky, which I now know that's the correct rendering of his name from a Japanese historian. And Icky comes down with this group, lands east of the American perimeter, but before he can get there, for the first time, aircraft are forwarded to operate out of Henderson Field. 2 Marine squadrons arrive, and they form the nucleus of what's going to be called the Cactus Air Force. Cactus is the very appropriate code name for the island of Guadalcanal. And in American military history, this is a very important point. Up to this point, operations by the American Army and the American Navy have been those of cooperation, not subordination, whatever here. For the first time, the Cactus Air Force, you're going to have, at least initially, a Marine officer commanding aircraft of the Marine Corps, of the Navy, of the Army Air Force. There'll even be some New Zealanders that will show up. And it will be a command, not a cooperative arrangement. And this, at the time when we got the jointness religion back under Colin Powell or whatever here, I had a little burst of interest from the armed services to preach the virtues of jointness based on what happened at Guadalcanal. Well, Icky takes his command down and does the one most stupid thing he could do, which is attacking exactly where the Marines are prepared on the eastern side of the perimeter, and the Marines envelop him and basically slaughter his command that he brought with him. There are over 700 Japanese dead laying in this area, and this, which we called the Battle of the Teneru, which was actually fought on Alligator Creek, I call this the most important small battle of the Pacific War, because up to this point, no American had faced the Japanese on the ground. All of them were either dead or prisoners of the Japanese. This is where the American Armed Services are going to discern for the first time what the terms on which the Pacific War is going to be fought. Shortly before this battle, a Marine patrol is ambushed, and the few survivors that come back announce the Japanese are not taking prisoners. When the Marines and their corpsmen attempt to take prisoners or even treat surviving wounded Japanese, instead of being received as saviors, mostly the Japanese either kill themselves or attempt to kill themselves and an American as we're attempting to provide succor. And this is the moment when the framework of how the rest of the war is going to be fought is set here. So immediately after this, we have what's called the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, which is the third major carrier battle of 1942. I'm not going to get into all the details about Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. I think his thinking and his command is well captured by John Lungstrom in his accounts of this. It's a very different story from some of the early histories where he's sort of the bad guy in the whole equation. But Fletcher realized right from the time he received the operational order that he was convinced the Japanese would react violently to a landing on Guadalcanal, and that he would eventually have to win another carrier battle, the third, to maintain the position of the Marines on the island. And he conducted himself under those understandings of what the situation was. In this battle, it's clearly a tactical victory for the U.S. We sink one Japanese light carrier. The carrier Enterprise is damaged. The point I would like to highlight here, I've got in red. I can't begin to get into all the details, but throughout this entire period, particularly from August to November 1942, there is an almost continuous, ongoing attritional air campaign. The Japanese are constantly trying to bomb Guadalcanal and the shipping off of Guadalcanal. We're trying to defend. It's a grinding attrition. At one point, we get down to only 4 operational fighters. We get some breaks from the weather, but throughout the campaign that's going on here, like I said, too many small details to talk about. What's going on is this tremendous attrition of Japanese aircrew, and this is one of the most dramatic moments of it. We'll have one more, but it shows you what it's costing the Japanese and their best pre-war trained aircrew. So the situation, both tactically and operationally at this time, is very peculiar. I call it a mutual siege. What has happened is the fact that as long as we hold Henderson Field, we can station fighters to fend off Japanese air attacks. We can protect the Navy to bring in cargo ships 2 or 3 at a time to provide resupply to the Marines, just barely. Meanwhile, what the Japanese are faced with the fact that those American aircraft at Guadalcanal prevent them from using cargo ships to resupply their troops on Guadalcanal. What they have to do is employ fast warships, usually destroyers, which come down from Rabaul. They try to reach the outer edge of this attack profile from Guadalcanal of American aircraft by about dusk, then dash in at night, drop off soldiers and supplies, a lot more soldiers than supplies, and then dash back out, hopefully before daylight, and they be attacked by U.S. aircraft. So there's this change of sea control every 12 hours that goes on for day after day, week after week, month after month, and breaking that, of course, is going to be critical to the outcome of the battle. So immediately after August, the calendar shows September, and as you're going to see, there's a monthly Japanese land offensive at Guadalcanal. And in this case, they send down a brigade. They've gone from a battalion-sized unit to a brigade-sized unit. General Kawaguchi, who is probably the most astute senior Japanese Imperial Army officer on Guadalcanal. And he brings his command mostly to the east side of the American perimeter. He decides, however, instead of doing an Icky and going straight in along the coast, he wants to do this inland march and attack from the south, which he thinks might be the undefended part of the American perimeter. And when he makes his plan, he's exactly right. By the time he completes the march, however, the Marines have detected the fact that this movement is in order, and they station the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion on this feature just south of Henderson Field, which can be called Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge. And Kawaguchi's command attacks on 2 nights in September. You get the picture of where he's coming from. It's as close as the Japanese come to really not delivering a knockout blow from the land. And he comes really close to winning. It's leadership by Merritt Edson and some other Marine officers and non-commissioned officers. Courage and effective artillery fire basically wins the day. And it also helps that one of the Japanese infantry battalions becomes lost and misses the battle. So once again, we've had an up arrow. Now what happens next? Of course, we're going to try to run up our first major resupply reinforcement to Guadalcanal, the 7th Marine Regiment. And the convoy that's running them up is being accompanied by 2 American carriers, and during that movement, the carrier Wasp is sunk by a Japanese submarine. At this point, with the Enterprise damaged and the Wasp sunk, and the Saratoga had been damaged by a Japanese submarine prior to this, there's only one operational American carrier in the South Pacific, the Hornet. The Japanese now look again to try another effort, this time for October, and you could call this the We Mean Business Plan. This is going to be an operation of lifting an entire Japanese division, the Sendai Division, which is one of the most distinguished in the Imperial Army. And they realize that to get them down there, they've got to deal with those American aircraft on Guadalcanal. There's going to be an air attrition campaign. There's going to be running these soldiers down. And then the capstone is going to be a battleship bombardment to finally knock out American air power. And this brings us to mid-October. An American cruiser-destroyer group under a Rear Admiral named Norman Scott wins a battle against the Japanese cruiser-destroyer group at the Battle of Cape Esperance. This occurs on Columbus Day in the U.S. However, within 24 hours, what happens is the Japanese launch 2 air raids against the island just as an Army infantry regiment is brought up, the first regiment of the Army to come to Guadalcanal, the 164th Infantry. Then Japanese artillery began shelling the western end of Henderson Field, and then that night, just after midnight, 2 Japanese battleships cruise off the coast of Guadalcanal, and they will, in 82.5 minutes, shell Guadalcanal with almost 1,000 14-inch shells. Now, 14-inch is not the length, it's the diameter of the shells. Each shell is about 1,500 pounds. There is not 1 square inch of the American perimeter on Guadalcanal that's proof against that type of ordnance. It absolutely devastates everything above ground, knocks out most of the American attack aircraft, stripping us of an offensive capability, and completely devastates our ability to interfere with the convoy that's coming down. It, in my view, is maybe the most single intense bombardment American soldiers have ever faced. 82.5 minutes, and about I think it's 1,300,000 pounds of ordnance comes crashing down into the area being held by the Americans. Amazingly, however, it only kills 41 Americans. That's part of the equation. Now, the Japanese bring in their high-speed convoy, as they call it. It is able to anchor off the coast of Guadalcanal in places within eyesight of the Marines. And at this point, everything looks like it's going to hell in a handbasket at Guadalcanal. And where there's been, prior to this point, undue optimism in Washington, now suddenly it totally reverses, and Washington becomes flatly defeatist about the prospects of holding out at Guadalcanal. The Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, is asked point blank by a reporter, are we going to hold Guadalcanal? And he says, there's a good stiff fight going on out there. Everybody hopes we can hold on. Hope is not a plan, okay? And they also begin releasing a lot of much more informative information about just exactly how dire is the situation on Guadalcanal. And this will play an important part later in the campaign. Admiral Nimitz, who's been watching what's been going on, the theater commander at the beginning was an admiral named Robert Gormley. Admiral Nimitz comes down, inspects the South Pacific. He goes to Guadalcanal, which Admiral Gormley, for reasons that are totally inexplicable, never had done, and decides that Gormley is not up to the task of facing the crisis. In Gormley's defense, I would say that being extremely pessimistic about what the situation is not being without insight as to what's actually going on at this point. But Admiral Nimitz decides that the guy to bring in is Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. There's a lot of controversy among his staff about whether Halsey's really up to a theater-level command as opposed to running a naval task force, but Nimitz decides he's the guy for the job. And in fact, this is going to be Halsey's finest hour as far as I'm concerned during the war. Halsey asked General Vandegrift, the commander of the 1st Marine Division, come back and have a conference. And in that conference, he asked Vandegrift, what do you need? And Vandegrift says, we just need more support. And if Vandegrift had hurled a spear into Halsey's chest, he probably couldn't have wounded him more, because it's obvious that what he's saying is the Navy hasn't been holding up his end. And by this time, Guadalcanal is recognized as an epic struggle. The Marines, of course, are shining brightly to the American public in holding Guadalcanal. And it's clear that the Navy's got to do more, and Halsey says he will, and he certainly makes good on that pledge. So those soldiers that have been landed by the high-speed convoy, they have to have a plan. And what they look at is they see that if they try to do the obvious thing, which is marching down the coast, this time from the west side, they'll get into a firepower contest that they can't possibly win because of logistics. So they decide to do a deep inland march like Kawaguchi had done, this time, however, from the west. The Marines, however, face a very difficult tactical situation. They understand that holding Henderson Field, and now we have a couple of satellites, that is absolutely critical to maintaining our position on Guadalcanal. But they further recognize that holding those airfields is not just holding the dirt those airfields are on, it's keeping the Japanese from placing direct or indirect fire on those airfields so we can operate those airfields effectively. That means they have to spread out to try to keep the Japanese as far away as possible, and that means they're thinned out, particularly toward the south or whatever here. Well, they do make one astute calculation. That's that if the Japanese do exercise an opportunity to try to march through the jungle, the Japanese will become exhausted and disorganized, and that's what they're counting on in their dispositions. So the Japanese come on. They are, in fact, delayed several times. They have to postpone the attack. And then in this period between the 21st and 26th of October, first they do a feint along the coast to try to fool the Marines about what's going on. But on the night of 24-25 October, the Sendai Division is advancing towards the southern part of the American perimeter. In theory, there are 3 regiments coming forward, 9 battalions. They're heading for a section of the perimeter that's originally a regimental section. It's now held by only 1 battalion of Marines. It just happens to be the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller. The Japanese, instead of being able to attack by regiments or battalions, they're so disorganized and confused during the night, and some of the units actually get lost. They come forward in platoons and companies, and the Marines just barely hold on that night. They're reinforced by some soldiers. If you've seen the HBO series, The Pacific, there's I think, a brilliant recreation of Sergeant John Basilone's battle that night. It's about as accurate as you could make it in Hollywood. So the Marines hold the airfield and inflict terrible losses on the Sendai Division, which suffers even further losses when it's trying to withdraw. So Halsey, having promised to provide all possible support, he knows that the Japanese have carrier task forces loitering near Guadalcanal to support the Japanese ground effort, and Halsey decides to send 2 of his carriers to take on these Japanese task forces. Now, you can very well ask, was this really necessary? And was it really prudent? Well, what happens in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands is that we take on the Japanese and we come extremely close to catastrophe. The carrier Hornet is sunk. The carrier Enterprise is badly damaged and comes damn close to being sunk. The Japanese execute some of their finest carrier attacks during the entire war. But when it's all over, what happens is that we lose the Hornet. They do not lose any carriers. However, when you total up the aircrew losses, we lose 24 aircrew. They lose 148 aircrew. That's more aircrew that they lost at the Battle of Midway. And this is another indication of this tremendous attrition Japanese air units are sustaining, especially Imperial Navy air units are sustaining during this campaign. So that ends the chapter in October. So at the end of the month, the Japanese are looking at the whole question of, well, do we try again or do we not try again? And by this time, the Imperial Army, which had been skeptical initially up to this point about the significance of Guadalcanal, decides this is a decisive battle. In the Japanese military lexicon, a decisive battle is a very big deal. Meanwhile, the Imperial Navy is far too optimistic about what damage they had inflicted. This is a little side issue John and I and some of our colleagues we've talked about often. The Japanese have the facility for overestimating the damage they're inflicting on the enemy. Now, everyone does that, but the Japanese do it on a scale which is unmatched, and they think they've sunk 4 American carriers at Santa Cruz. And the other thing is, and I've mentioned this to some journalists, and strangely enough, this never shows up in their accounts. All these accounts of how grim and the situation looks on Guadalcanal, how close the Japanese came to victory in October, which are on the airways and being monitored by the Japanese. And the Japanese Official History Series says they monitor this, and it says, what were they thinking? You know? And based on these elements or whatever, they decide, okay, November is going to be a repeat of October, except basically sort of beefed up. And we're going to do the battleship an air campaign, a battleship bombardment, a much larger convoy, partly to make up for the enormous supply deficit for the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, who are calling this Starvation Island at this point. For the first time in the course of the campaign, we have a serious level of code-breaking breakthrough in terms of actually giving us the Japanese plans. Not all the plans, but some of the plans. And there's a lot of interesting background about all this. I've written about in another article I'm not going to get into here, but believe me, it was not like before Midway where we have this whole plan laid out. We were operating pretty much in the dark between August and the last weeks of October of '42, and we get this initial breakthrough. And Halsey plans to basically, run up our own reinforcement and also to block the Japanese in their campaign, and he has some idea about what's going on. So we get into the first phase of what's going to be called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal between the 12th and the 15th of November 1942. There's an air attack against one of our air convoys on the, one of our reinforcement convoys coming up on the 12th. Then that night, rolling into the 13th of November, which interesting, the U.S. Navy has never come up with a separate designation for this battle. I call it the Battle of Friday the 13th, which seemed to me as good a title as any. We have a scratch task force under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. Admiral Norman Scott is also present, but he's subordinate to Callahan. This lineup, I would say, if you want to summarize it, if you were a war gamer, you would say the Japanese combat power going into this action is at least double or more of what Callahan has to face against the Japanese. And the action eventually devolves down to this, as one person described it, a Pier 6 brawl. Incredibly close range, confused, savage. There's really nothing quite like this individual service action during the entirety of World War II. This is the U.S. flagship that Callahan was on, the USS San Francisco. The white circles represent major caliber gunfire hits on the ship, or just some of them. The San Francisco is going to pass within about 4,000 yards, which is like shotguns at 3 paces or whatever here in naval warfare concepts or whatever here. In this engagement, Admiral Callahan and most of his staff is killed. The captain of the San Francisco is killed. The executive officer of the San Francisco is killed. The acting executive officer of the San Francisco is killed. The next man in seniority is the navigator. He's blown off a bridge level. He lands on the barrel of a 5-inch gun. The crew assumes he's dead, tosses him aside. He lands on the deck in a puddle and is drowning because he's so completely shattered. A black messmate who's acting as a corpsman finds him and pulls him out of the puddle and saves his life. On the bridge of the San Francisco, there was a 32-year-old signal officer, Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless. If you had made a linear list of every senior officer in the task force going in, he would have been somewhere south of 60 as far as I can calculate. But Bruce McCandless comes to the bridge and realizes effectively he is the commander of the San Francisco. And more importantly, he recognizes that in this incredible melee that they're engaged in, with all communications out, that the other ships of the task force will probably do the way navies have always done, make your movements in accord with the flagship. And at the moment he realizes this, San Francisco has been hit by 45 shells. There are 25 fires burning in various places. There are 500 tons of water sloshing around in places it's not supposed to be. And the ship's head is coming around out of the battle. And he orders the young sailor who takes the helm from the original helmsman who has been killed, and orders him to turn the San Francisco head right back into the Japanese formation. And the San Francisco does so. The other ships comply. There's tremendous losses among the American ships involved in this action, but they do the one thing that they have to do. They break the nerve of the Japanese commander, Rear Admiral named Abe, and he calls off the bombardment of Henderson Field. In the course of this action and the loss of the Juno the next day with most of the crew, 1,439 U.S. sailors died within about 24 hours. It's one of the worst losses the U.S. Navy has ever experienced in the war, and that's close to how many soldiers and sailors die in the whole soldiers and Marines die in the whole campaign. The Japanese are not done. They send some cruisers down the very next night to try to do what the battleships had failed to do, and they fire, but they miss. Fortunately for us, on the 14th, this big reinforcement convoy is then pummeled by American aircraft on Guadalcanal and supported by the carrier Enterprise. They also sink the crippled Japanese battleship, flagship, the Hiei. By the end of the day, of the 11 Japanese transports that were brought in, 1 is turned back, 6 are sunk or sinking, and 4 are still going towards Guadalcanal. And the Japanese are not done. They send in another bombardment group, this time a single battleship with cruisers and destroyers supporting. And Admiral Halsey at this point is like a gambler with his very last chips. He's all in with Halsey. And so he sends in 2 fast battleships and a scratch group of destroyers that are just put together because they have the most fuel, and sends them in under Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee. If you'd looked at the entire roster of the U.S. Navy in November 1942 and tried to figure out who was the guy to command for this, this is the single guy you'd want to have there. He was an expert in gunnery. He knew his radar. In the course of the action, however, again, the U.S. Navy demonstrates it's still not in the same league with the Japanese. 3 of the 4 destroyers are sunk or as a result of the action. The battleship South Dakota basically takes itself out of the action due to a power failure, and then gets pummeled by the Japanese and then loses its effectiveness, loses both its situational appreciation and also its combat effectiveness with its weapons. His captain takes him out. So we're down to Admiral Lee and his flagship, the USS Washington. And Lee, now that South Dakota has neatly solved the problem of knowing exactly where the Japanese are, the Washington cuts loose, it sinks the Japanese battleship, it then leads the rest of the Japanese task forces on a merry chase away from Guadalcanal. And at the end of it, the next morning, these 4 remaining transports come in, are beached, and then were pummeled by our U.S. air and naval forces. As a Japanese officer will write afterwards, this battle is what he calls the fork in the road, leading to victory or defeat. Now, it's not quite so clear at the moment to the Japanese, but effectively that's right. And this is the moment when it becomes clear that we are going to hold Guadalcanal, and the Secretary of the Navy announces that publicly. It's interesting, and as John pointed out, there is this sequence of events in just 16 days. On the 3rd of November, the British prevail finally at El Alamein. On the 14th and 15th of November, the U.S. Navy finally prevails at Guadalcanal. On the 19th of November, the Soviet Union is going to launch the Stalingrad counteroffensive. So all of that takes place within that span. There's also the landing on North Africa, which doesn't involve as much fighting as these other elements do. But this whole turn of the tide, or the hinge of fate, as Churchill calls it, all happens in that incredibly close span at that time. Even though the war has not been totally determined at that point, it certainly has changed dramatically from where it was going through the rest of 1942. To sum up, the Navy then promptly gets humiliated again at the Battle of Tassafaronga. We sent a cruiser-destroyer group in that basically gets its tail handed to it by the Japanese destroyer force. The good thing is they keep the Japanese from landing any food, and by now the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal are in dire straits and just getting worse and worse. In these night service actions, one comment here you can make about technology is, we have radar. This is supposed to be the panacea. But you'll see that what happens in these service actions is there's no correlation between who has radar, who doesn't, who sights who first, or whatever here. It just comes down to, a lot of tactical finesse and capability after the engagement starts. So the Japanese, initially in December, amazingly enough, are going to try a 5th time to come back and take Guadalcanal. But finally, sober minds point out that the amount of shipping that's going to be required to do this is basically going to cripple Japan's whole war economy for 1943, and they decide to withdraw. And there's nothing they do at this campaign that is so good as what their exit. We fail to pick up what they're trying to do. I would give a lot of leeway to the intelligence people who basically, they're looking at 4 consecutive efforts. The 5th effort is about to start. Then they change their mind, and you don't pick that up. The Army takes over. This is John McManus's territory. He'll tell you about the Army in the Pacific. And the counteroffensive is restrained because they're constantly worried about the Japanese coming back again and trying to retake Henderson Field, and while the main forces are heading up the coast of Guadalcanal towards the northwest. The Japanese, it's just their best part of the Guadalcanal campaign. They get about 10,000 soldiers, survivors, out of their original garrison. This is a highlight of the attrition campaign. You'll see that both sides lose over 600 aircraft. I think the total number of British fighters lost in the Battle of Britain is like 712 or something like that. To conduct this intense an air campaign in the South Pacific in 1942 with this level of losses will give you some indication of just how incredibly logistically challenged it all was to try to get this done. The big thing is that we save a whole lot more of our aircrew than they do. Naval losses pretty much wash, except of course we have a capacity to replace that they don't. Fatal casualties during the campaign. The point I would emphasize here that for all of the fact that the campaign becomes best known by far with the stand of the 1st Marine Division holding out from August to December, at the end of the day, to hold Guadalcanal, almost 3 sailors are going to die for every soldier or Marine who fights at Guadalcanal. And the Japanese losses are primarily due to disease and starvation, not battle casualties. And I see it as a turning point. Japanese are still in the offensive in the summer of '42, and this is what seizes the initiative for us. And it inflicts this attrition rate on their air and light naval forces that's going to be very important as the war plays on. Now, the other thing that Guadalcanal does, it basically prevents a link-up of 2 of the most sinister forces that the world has faced. This nightmare of a link-up across the Indian Ocean. Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I agree with John that the Japanese didn't have this overwhelming capacity to link up with the Germans across the Indian Ocean. What they did do, I think, they could have conducted a lot of attritional campaigns against that supply line running up that both went to the Middle East and also went to India, and that was very perilous. It's very interesting that then Brigadier General Dwight Eisenhower in early 1942 writes a memo about the 3 essentials for the Allies to win the war. He said the 3 essentials are to keep the Soviet Union in the war, to keep the British in the war, and to prevent a link-up of the Germans and the Japanese across the Indian Ocean. And that's what effectively Midway and Guadalcanal do, is they snuff out any likelihood of this. And finally, let me come back to the point I made at the start. When things looked darkest in October 1942, the New York Times wrote an editorial that was read effectively like a eulogy, that it was going to be lost, and this is what they wanted to say about the effort and the significance of the effort. And you'll see that in Guadalcanal, the name that will not die out in the memories of this generation, it will endure in honor. Later, James Jones, the novelist, who writes a great novel about Guadalcanal called The Thin Red Line, he sets it on Guadalcanal, and in a preface he says, "I set it on Guadalcanal because what Guadalcanal meant for my generation was a very special thing. It was basically the point where the Americans who would fight the war on the ground, in the air, at sea, demonstrated they could win against adversity." Thank you.
Of code breaking at this point in 1942 was the Japanese JN-25 code had been broken, but the Army code had not been broken. So how much did that influence what was going on from, I guess, mid 42 onward? Okay.
The question is, what was the influence of code breaking at this phase? And the gentleman correctly points out we're not really reading Imperial Army codes at this point. We don't get a serious breakthrough until 1944. With respect, in just a very condensed version, what happens is the Japanese, in August of 42, institute a major change in their naval communication system. They change not just the code and the cipher, but what we call the rules of usage about how it's done. They split the traffic up. There's no longer one major system, JN-25. There's what we call 4 channels. It takes us a while to figure out what they are. Each one has a different code, a different cipher system, different rules of usage. And it's not until October that we begin to tap in a little bit. So basically, this is not a period of the war in which we are getting a great foreknowledge of what Japanese plans and intentions are. We're getting very little right up to the naval battle of Guadalcanal, when just in time we do get important information. And I've got a lot more to say about this, about what happens between May of 42 and January of 1945, which is a much more complex story in which the Japanese are dueling sometimes quite effectively against Allied code breakers at the time. Oh, yes.
This is from our virtual audience, from Joseph Hudson. And his question is, in retrospect, was Admiral King's decision to seize Guadalcanal in August of 1942 the correct strategic determination?
Well, since we won, it was correct. But like I said, it's a very close-run thing. I mean, it could have gone. The Japanese could have won virtually at any point between August and November, had they simply concentrated their forces and decided to do everything that they eventually did piecemeal. We would have been in dire straits. So, yeah, and I've speculated that had it been a failure, Admiral King presumably would have been dismissed. I mean, that was his baby, and it ends up in a spectacular defeat. I don't think he's going to survive as Chief of Naval Operations. Well, thank you very much.